Welcome back to part 2 of the Conqueror Realism analysis. Here we will talk about armors, finishers, and emotes. He doesn't have anything interesting that I want to talk about for his feats or his signatures, and all of his ornaments look like someone TIG welded some scrap metal they found in their garage onto Conqueror's forehead, and he just hasn't realized it yet. Now with that out of the way, you already know how this works by now, and if you don't, welcome to the channel. But anyways, let's just get right into it. We are starting off with Conk's helmet options. He has, in very broad categories, two types of helmets. He has the enclosed helm variants and he has the kettle helm variants. We'll start with the one that's most quickly to explain, which is the kettle helm. Kettle helms have always been a staple of mid to late medieval helmets just due to its effective yet simple and inexpensive design. It gets its name from the English perspective of it looking like a kettle, yet in German and French it was known more as the iron hat in their respective languages. What makes it ubiquitously hat-like is the brim that all kettle helms appear to have. Now the overall design for the kettle helm appears to come in many different forms, so many that it would take a very long time to go over all that have been documented. So instead, let's focus on the ones the Conqueror has at his disposal. Before we get to that, to my knowledge, there are no kettle helms that cover the face. If you can find any source that contradicts that, I'd love to know. For people that use the kettle helm, there's no such need for an attribute like face protection for mostly two reasons. First, it would limit their overall sense, which might include their sight and hearing, but it also might limit their breathing as well. Now, if you're your everyday guardsman or you're just manning a gate during peace times, that would be quite cumbersome for your everyday job. Secondly, the key allure to using a kettle helm is its simplicity and its cost. This means that should it get damaged or should you lose it, it would be something that you could replace. Especially if you had an outfit an entire battalion of men-at-arms, you'd probably want to find the most inexpensive option that would still provide protection for them. In later periods when kettle helms were in use, you could also find people who were using sallets as well. And in the case of the sallet, you could provide full face protection with an attachment of a plate bearer to it. So again, the kettle helm fits a very specific purpose that does not need to fill another. And technically you could wear a plate bearer with the kettle helm, but that's a tangent about armor that I don't want to go down right now. Back to Conqueror's kettle helm options, we can separate them into three different designs. I'll call each design the fluted variant, the pointed variant, and the center ridge variant respectively. Now, these helmets, without their face protection of course, are all very realistic, and I would even go as far to say historically accurate. Now, the backing that all of them have is usually comprised of some sort of leather strips or some sort of studding. This isn't needed as the brim of the helmet itself should protect the back of your head from downward strikes, which is going to be the most likely form of attack that someone is going to encounter. That being said, to truly protect the back of your head, and really any exposed part of your body in general, would be with mail. It is very common to see the kettle helm paired with some sort of mail coif. Could it be paired without a mail coif? Of course. It could be paired with a padded coif or just without any layer at all, so long as your helmet has a lining to it. That being said, their choice of using leather strips is interesting, but I don't think it takes away from the general effectiveness of the helm. So let's quickly touch on each kettle helm variant before we move on to the enclosed helms. Fluting is quite the difficult procedure, which makes it quite interesting why it'd be done to something as common as a kettle helm. But you have to remember that kettle helms weren't just used by the poor. They were just a useful helmet that were worn by all classes of soldiers, especially if they wanted a helmet that would have good ventilation. So could I see a smith taking the time to make a fluted kettle helm? Sure, if someone paid them to do it. Fluting on armor doesn't just make it look better too, it also reinforces it slightly by adding more thickness to where the bumps are. Moving on, we have the pointed variant. Now this variant you might have seen before, either in historical depictions or maybe you've seen a reproduction of this type of armor. This is probably my favorite of the kettle helms just due to its shape. Now the in-game one seems to have another plate of metal riveted onto the front of it. Maybe this is some sort of repair instead of replacing it, or maybe this is some sort of reinforcement attached to provide better protection. I have no idea as I haven't seen something like this before. If you have any information about it, let me know. Finally, we have the center ridged variant. It's kind of reminiscent of an Italian style of kettle helm, but with much more pronounced center ridge. Now I love simplicity, and this one definitely gets an A+ in that category. There is nothing on this helmet except flat metal, so that means no attachments, no engravings, no riveting, just a simple metal helmet. And that truly summarizes the charm about this style of helmet. I'm adding in a helmet because I finished the script before the new armors drop, but once I got a chance to look at Conk's new helmet up close, wow. The entire edge of the helmet is lined with fleur-de-lis. The breaths on the face mask have quatrefoils in them. This mask is so ornate, it's almost a shame what armor it was paired with. If Conqueror ends up getting a set of armor this detailed in the future, then it will be a bright future indeed for Conks. That sums up kettle helms. Now you might be wondering, what about the face protection? I can't say anything about them historically, and well, if you see my previous videos then you already know what's going on. Does it have ventilation? Yes? Good. Does it have dedicated eye slits? Yes? Good. If you want more information, I think that Warden Part 2 would be a good place to get my opinion on it. Otherwise, feel free to ask a question about it and I'll help give my opinion on it. Now we can move on to the enclosed helm. Now you might be wondering why I call it the enclosed helm, and that's due to its place in history. This was the helm that bridges the gap between older style of nasal helm, which provides little to no face protection, to the great helm, which can encompass an entire user's head. The enclosed helm was the first design to try and protect the face while also being a part of the top of the head protection as well. This then created a design where it's almost like a mask that was attached to your average helmet. Now, there aren't any surviving examples of this helmet from what I could find, but there are multiple examples in artwork and in effigies that give us a general idea of what it'll look like. As you can see, the concept of the Great Helm was there, but it hadn't been fully envisioned yet. It also may seem like they all have different features, and that might be the case as this was a time that they were experimenting all the way up until we see as the Bucket Helm Great Helm is, and even then, that adapted into the Sugarloaf Helm. That's a completely different story for another time though. Let's look at Conqueror's helmets and see what we got. So basically, there are only 8 helmets that fit into this enclosed helm category, and really only one of them I could recommend as most realistic. The best out of the options, in my opinion, would be the Regulus helm. This helmet has all the designs of your average enclosed helm, including a face protection with eye slits and ventilation, and a flat top that was common at the time due to them experimenting with what designs were most effective for combat. Now, usually the wearer would have some sort of male coif to protect their neck and the back of their head region, but it appears that we have something different here. It looks like some sort of chainmail aventail with some sort of leather liner to back it up. For starters, those rings on the chainmail are much too big. Smaller pointed objects would have a much easier chance to slip through there. Also, why is the Conqueror wearing a do-rag underneath his helmet? Regardless, the fact that he has chainmail to begin with and has a pretty historically accurate helm to pair with it makes this the best helm out of all of his options for realism. As for his other options, well, either there's no dedicated way for him to see out of the helmet, or it's just ridiculously over the top with spikes and such. More specifically, the ones he most recently got before Year 4 armor actually have much thicker and much better chainmail than the Regulus one. But because the face protection themselves are just too outlandish, it couldn't take first place. And I don't mean the skull one or the face mask one, I mean the one where it's being held up with leather straps. What is this? He looks like medieval Bane.
Oh, you think
Shield Bash.
this is your ally? You merely adopted the
Bash.
I was born in it, molded by it. I didn't see the light until I was already a man. By then it was nothing to me but blinding.
Okay, enough of that, let's move on. Now we're going to look at arms. Now, lore-wise, I understand that the Conqueror is basically a conscripted criminal. I think it's also said that they are basically what used to be minions, and then after showing exemplary work on the battlefield, were then permitted to become a Conqueror. Hence why they both use the heater shield. I can't remember how accurate all of that is, but you get the gist of it. Basically, the Conqueror is poor. This would explain why the helmet options are that of someone with a budget, to say the least. He doesn't have the newest great helm like the Warden does, or he uses a kettle helm, which like the current version of the minions use as well. With that being said, it doesn't explain why his armor choices for his arms are the way that they are. In some cases, his chains wrap around his arms, most likely to reference his criminal background and the fact that he's still bound in chains even though he is on the battlefield. I suppose for lore reasons this makes sense, but we aren't here to talk about the lore. We're here to talk about whether or not it's practical. I don't think I need to say something about this, but just to be completely clear so everyone understands, no. Wearing chains around your forearm does not constitute as armor. No, Conqueror, spikes attached to leather doesn't count either. For the sake of brevity, I won't be going over all the variants of armor. Again, like always, if you have any questions on something specific, feel free to ask. But I will talk about a few. For starters, I want to talk about the Somber Exodus or Prison Guard, or really any of these variants because they all have this. Besides the weird plate squares on his biceps that are useless and barely count as a form of protection, we're actually here to talk about the forearms. I get it, he's poor, he can't afford a lot of armor. Okay, I understand that. But then why does he put, which I can only presume, the one forearm bracer that he has behind his shield instead of his exposed arm? It just doesn't make sense. Even if it's the excuse of what if something breaks the shield and goes into his arm, then unless it damages the joint in his elbow, which the bracer wouldn't even protect, and he can still raise his arm, he can fight. The shield is strapped to him. Meanwhile, if he were to take serious damage to his primary weapon hand, and could no longer hold a weapon, he'd be basically defenseless on a battlefield. Food for thought. Moving on. Let's talk about the Megares arms and any of its variants. This one definitely has a lot of promise to it, except for two things. One, like always, the pauldrons on the shoulders are way too large. This probably seems redundant at this point after talking about Warden and Lawbringer, but that doesn't change the fact that it's still a hindrance to the user. Second, the random leather with spikes added onto it. They all had this and it just doesn't make sense, especially since it looks like there's mail underneath it. Why add the spikes if you already have decent protection? All the spikes will do is make you get caught on stuff, or even worse, get your enemy's weapon caught on you. There's a reason why armor became more rounded the further we go into its evolution. We want the enemy's blows to glance off us, not stop dead in its tracks and transfer all of that force. Positive things I could say about this is the chainmail, always good to have. He also has some form of remedial gauntlet on each hand, which is definitely better than an exposed hand. And lastly, he has more plate protection on his exposed shoulder than he does on his shielded shoulder. Overall, a good armor piece, but it could have been better. Lastly, I want to talk about the Sinister Silence arms and any of its variants. Now, when talking about the combination of armors as in Brigandine with mail, plate with mail, or plate, Brigandine, and mail, we can't exclude the fact that in some cases you can't have all. I think that in this armor piece, it's a great example to show that if all you have is plate available, then you're just going to wear that. And it's a feasible option considering that plate is probably some of the best armor you can wear, and we know that it can be worn by itself. The problem I have with this is never in my whole life have I ever seen someone wear plate upon their bare skin like that. Like, that doesn't even make sense, man. Sure, maybe you don't have mail to put underneath it, and okay, maybe you're so poor that you can't afford a gambeson to go underneath it. But you're telling me you couldn't even find a long sleeve shirt? Like, that has to be incredibly uncomfortable with the cold metal pressed against your skin and it chafing against you all day while you're fighting. You're telling me that you could afford plate, but not a shirt? Or you're telling me that you looted this plate off of another soldier, but you didn't take what he was wearing under that? I don't get it. As for some of the positives for this armor, the shoulders don't look like the size of dwarf planets, so I'm calling that a win. Also, even though there isn't anything under the plate which would help absorb any blows to the arm, the plate itself seems to have quite a bit of coverage, and it's always better to have bruises than deep rending slashes to your arms. Overall, I think that this is the best out of all of them due to the complete coverage and the fact that it's more consolidated than the rest, regardless of how uncomfortable that has to be. Now time to move to chest pieces. To make it short, all the base game ones are bad. They shouldn't even be considered as chest protection. Sure, you get to see some cool things like some medieval plaque belts here and there, and also some plate gorgets, but overall it looks like there isn't anything protecting his actual center of mass. You know, the thing that holds your lungs, and your heart, and your intestines, But as is the case with a lot of armors for the knights, when they did a massive drop of brand new armors, it brought a bunch of new looks and new armors that in some cases happen to be better than the base game sets. For Conqueror, he received the Woeful Persuasion set, the Mortal Enemy set, the Sinister Silence set, and the Cruel Passage set. Besides the fact that these names sound like a 13-year-old version of me trying to come up with a sick name for a band, these are all relatively solid pieces of chest armor. But the one I'm going to focus on out of all of them is going to be the Woeful Persuasion chest. It was a hard choice, but I'll explain why I chose this one. For all of these armor variants, you can see a piece of chainmail hanging down the center. This leads us to believe that there is some sort of chainmail hauberk underneath his coat, which is a great start considering that it already has more armor than all of the base game sets. The rings for the chainmail look heavily stacked too, so that makes it even stronger. There's also a bunch of hanging discs for each armor set, and to be completely honest here, I don't know what these are. They seem like the discs that they'd use to protect the open joint areas of plate armor, so I'm just assuming that this is going to be even more armor linking together to make some sort of mail or scale type of protection for the sides of his body. As for the coat, I can't tell if it's some sort of quilted gambeson or some sort of leather. On the Mortal Enemy, it looks a little bit more like gambeson due to how it has some sort of pleated effect on it, Regardless, considering that he has a chainmail hauberk on and also has those discs to protect him, I think to say that him having a gambeson on top of that would just be icing on the cake, and realistically, considering that he's supposed to be the guy who's battling on a budget, I think that he's more than well suited for combat with this outfit, because remember, this armor is his second line of defense. Whatever doesn't hit his shield, he wants it to hit his armor and not him. Now, funnily enough, the only disadvantage this armor has to any of the base sets is that it doesn't have knee protection. Pretty much all of the base game sets have some sort of knee protection, but I think in the grand scheme of things, we can put that aside for a moment. He does have much thicker and much more protected riding boots, which are definitely going to be better than all the base game ones. The last thing I want to touch on is his belt. More specifically, what is on his belt. Unlike most other armor sets where the Conqueror wears a belt just to wear a belt, here you can see that he actually has multiple things on his belt that he could possibly need. He has a sidearm, which is a club, more technically a mace because it does have a metal head on it, so realistically if his flail were to break or if it were to be disarmed from him, he would immediately go for his sidearm and be back in the fight. This is another reason why I chose this variant specifically, as I personally think that the club with the large rounded studs on it is the best one compared to the others. I've explained why I like the rounded studs in part 1 where I'm talking about the different types of flail heads, so if you don't know because you haven't seen it, then why are you watching part 2 without watching part 1? Anyways, moving on, he also has what is technically a rough forged utility knife, as it's always handy to have some sort of knife like that, whether it's a last resort for fighting or if it's something simple like cutting food. I wish it was a little bigger and then it would remind me of a dussac, but I still really like how it is and I can't complain. Lastly, he has a pouch which could have a lot of things. It could possibly have money, but that's probably unlikely if he plans to go into battle, but he might have had it if he was marching somewhere and maybe was ambushed. In those situations, you really don't have time to be like, oh man, let me go put my money away. More realistically, and what I would probably have in there is at least bandages. You don't have to be a certified medic to understand, oh shit, I'm bleeding and I want that to stop. You might not fix the problem, and you might not even stop it from killing you, but it's better than bleeding out, or at least making it get worse faster. Overall, this belt of essential items makes this overall believable. This looks like a guy who's going into combat. This looks like a guy who needs a contingency plan. This looks like a guy who's actually human and knows that he needs to bring things along that would help, and that's what sells me and invests me into believing that this could be real. When you have a character whose clothes are tattered and they don't seem to have anything other than their weapon with them, I'm inclined to believe that they're incredibly unprepared, or they are fully expecting to die. It makes it even worse when you see the Wulin or even the samurai who have much better clothing and armor, and you realize that if they can do it, then why not me? Anyways, I'm getting on my soapbox again. This concludes armors, so let's move on to finishers. Again, I'm only going to talk about notable ones to save time. To start off, we have Garrote. So my first thing when I saw this is that the chain can't be long enough to actually do this. Lo and behold, it actually doesn't wrap around the neck when he goes to break it. In fact, even if it did, you can see that the way he steps forward would just unwrap it anyways. Either way, this doesn't make sense and it's just weird, so let's move on. So here we have the Pop-Tart. So here we have the Pop-Top. Oh my god. So here we have the Pop-Top. You can see that it's really simple and it's a good default execution. It's basic, but if we didn't have it, it just wouldn't be right. Now, the head flying off is a bit over the top, but considering that they have no other way to show someone's jaw getting pulverized into jelly, I think that this gets the point across. The wind-up is also really nice, and it's overall solid. Next, Mongrel's Charge. I like this one because you can see the shaft of the flail being used offensively, but besides that, the overall fluidity of it makes it very good. The jab with the shaft follow up by the punch with the shield, which disorients them long enough for the final swing that takes him out. Obviously this was a setup so that he could do his famous shield bash, but you can see the enemy just goes limply flying with it because they're pretty much dead at that point. Next we have Spike Punch. Now I'm going to be honest, I've never had to take a large iron ball and tried to bludgeon something with it. That being said, considering that you could bludgeon someone with a rock, if you had to take the end of a flail, so long as it wasn't spiky, that it would hurt you of course, and then beat someone to death with that, I could see that being somewhat possible. You'd have to do it when you saw an opening of course, and I would only do it if I took the enemy down to the floor first, but I don't think it's improbable. I do think, however, there might be more effective alternatives than this. Next we have Low Blow, another really simple one, but something that shows an effective way to use a flail. Like I said in part 1, the flail is all about momentum. You can see here that right after the underswing, the conch then pulls the weapon out and uses that momentum for the finishing strike by having his arm do a full rotation around his body. Another overall solid one. Next we have Spine Twister. I just wanted to talk about his use of the shield there. Punching someone with the edge of the shield is very painful to the target, especially if it were to the throat like that. It's another simple one, but it's all about the details. Lastly, we have Ferros Ferio. This one is really flashy, but I just love the overall body momentum on this. It starts with a strike to the knee, he then proceeds to let that momentum carry his body around so that he can follow up with a shield strike, and then he finishes off with a flourish with the flail. Regardless of how fancy it looks, none of this seems unrealistic, besides the person laying there, but I'm just going to assume that the Conqueror stunned him that hard with the initial hit. Finally, we will be talking about emotes, only a very few though because I don't really have a lot to say. First, we have Chain Dance. Don't know why they called it Chain Dance, as it's very obviously a flourish, but sure, Chain Dance. Next, we have Chest Out, which I like because it really shows us the flexibility of the weapon. That's pretty much it. In my opinion, this is like the one emote where it really looks like he has a flail and not a magical whip that wraps around things and seems weightless. Lastly, we have Macht der Virtut. If this seems familiar, that's because Lawbringer has an emote named the exact same thing. Macht der Virtut is basically a way of saying well done, but in a much more literal translation it is be blessed for your courage. In my opinion, this doesn't look like the Conqueror is saying well done, as I feel like he's trying to say I'm going to snap your neck like a twig. Well, I think that's going to be it for this video. If you like this video, leaving a like would be much appreciated. If you like content like this video, subscribing would be your best bet for keeping up to date with it. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or experiences wearing plate armor with nothing underneath and you'd like to share with the class, feel free to leave that down below. I try to check my comments frequently, but there's been a recent influx of people who have been joining us, which is great, but YouTube doesn't feel the need to notify me about it. So if I happen to not respond, it's not me, I blame YouTube. Or that's at least the excuse I'm going for with today. Again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in part 3, and I hope you have a great day. Peace.